Cheez-Its I could normally eat all day long, but without salt, they stuck to the roof of my mouth. I couldn't even swallow them. Frozen waffles lost their color and tasted like straw.
When journalist Michael Moss started taste testing, he wasn't working on just any old food story. He was investigating the science, the marketing, the psychology, and the corporate zeal behind addictive junk food. A trail of emails, whistleblowers, and sometimes contrite, sometimes unapologetic food executives led him to the unholy trinity of salt, sugar, and fat. The three ingredients that are consciously mixed into processed food to keep us snuffling through things we cannot stop eating. And by the way, the people who create that food don't always eat it. Michael Moss, author of Salt, Sugar, Fat, tells all in half an hour. But first, it's 9 a.m., 9:30 in Newfoundland and parts of Labrador. How much salt, sugar, and fat have you eaten so far?
Gee, Pop, is this where they're going to give you $500?
Yep. All I have to do is ride a mama bull.
Name?
Tony the Tiger.
What outfit from Tiger?
Sugar Frosted Flakes by Kellogg's out of Battle Creek.
Never heard of it.
Never heard of Sugar Frosted Flakes? Those big crisp flakes of corn with that secret toasted-in sugar frosting? They're great!
Well, that, of course, is Tony the Tiger, the longtime feline frontman for Kellogg's Sugar Frosted Flakes. He helped usher in a whole new way of marketing sugary cereals, and he features prominently in Michael Moss's new book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, How the Food Giants Hooked Us. Michael Moss is a Pulitzer-Prize-winning investigative journalist with the New York Times, and he's in Toronto. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Why is Tony the Tiger an important character in the marketing of sugary cereals?
Well, he came along and was an invention to help Kellogg market its sugary cereal. And what's really fascinating is that John Harvey Kellogg, a physician, hated sugar, and it was his little brother Will who decided that, hey, if we're going to be making cereal here, let's try to make it really popular, and they started adding sugar to the cereal. And I think Tony Tiger, which just came along as a creation of the Leo Burnett agency out of Chicago, and it just really struck a nerve with kids. They were head over heels for the cereal anyway, but the notion of using cartoon characters to sell what was already an irresistible product continued on for years and years and years, and it still does today.
Well, I remember Tony the Tiger. I grew up with him, and I still remember him. But
yes.
How does our brain react to sugar?
Kids especially are hardwired for sugar. Every one of their 10,000 little taste buds are just sitting there eager for the slightest sweet blast. And sugar goes directly to the pleasure center, sending electronic signals to the pleasure center of the brain, which says, hey, Michael, love that sweet taste, eat more. Especially with kids, because they're really attuned to getting lots of calories, growing little bodies, and sugar, 4 calories per gram is a great way, seemingly, for them to get instant energy.
How have the major food companies worked to exploit the craving?
They convincingly argue that they never intended to make us obese and otherwise ill. But every ounce of their formulation, marketing, advertising energy goes into making their products as perfectly, as irrepressibly attractive as possible. And so, for example, a legend in the industry, Howard Moskowitz, walks me through the creation of a new soda flavor. He calls it engineering food, not inventing.
Well, he's a mathematician and
he was the mathematician,
right?
and then trained in experimental psychology or experimental marketing at Harvard. And to get this perfect new flavor for Dr. Pepper, he came up with 61 different formulations of sweet flavoring, each slightly different than the rest, submitted those to some 3,000 consumer taste testings, and took all the data and threw it in his computer and did his regression analysis, and then hit what he calls and helped coin the bliss point. Because one interesting thing about sugar is you can get too much. Your listeners can do this experiment with coffee. If you like sugar in coffee, just keep adding sugar till you get to the perfect amount. keep adding more, you'll like it less.
So where you like it the most is your bliss point.
Yes, and Howard discovered sort of a bell-shaped curve, and at the top is the optimum amount of sugar. And the food industry has bliss points now for products all over the grocery store, which didn't even used to be sweet. Bread, tomato sauce, yogurt, of course. There's a bliss point for each of those.
Well, before we get on to the other foods, I want to play another commercial, again to do with cereal. You write about this. This is for Frosted Mini Wheats.
Okay, where were we?
We were on the third paragraph of page 57, and you were explaining that the stone structures made by ancient Romans were called aqueducts. And as you're writing that up on the board, your chalk broke into 3 pieces.
Right.
I've never been so proud.
A clinical study showed kids who had a filling breakfast of Frosted Mini Wheat cereal improved their attentiveness by nearly 20%.
20%? Okay, even I'm impressed by me.
Michael Moss, what's wrong with that commercial?
Well, there's a couple things it illustrates. One, the fierce competitiveness in the cereal aisle. Companies are jockeying for position all the time. Kellogg decided that its Frosted Minis were not performing well enough. They funded some research that compared kids who didn't eat any breakfast at all with kids who ate Frosted Minis and came up with this advertising. However, when the Federal Trade Commission actually looked at this Kellogg study, it turns out the commercial was exaggerating the data. It was more like 1 in 7 kids maybe had as much as a 20% gain in attentiveness. But the other thing about it, too, is that they weren't comparing Frosted Minis to what nutritionists say our kids should be eating for breakfast, whole wheat toast and oatmeal. They were comparing it to nothing at all.
The very sugary cereals have always been advertised to children. Why hasn't the government tried to stop that?
Oh, they did. I mean, back in the late 70s, again, the Federal Trade Commission really got on this, and they were petitioned by consumer advocates. They came up with the most amazing study looking at marketing, advertising, especially on Saturday morning cartoons, of sugary products to kids. And almost the very first line of their long investigative report laid it out, which was basically kids cannot tell the difference between advertising and reality. And the industry fought back with the best lobbyists that it could find. It protracted. It drew out the FTC's attempt to regulate the marketing. There was a change of administration. It died. The new FTC commissioner came in and said, hey, enough of this nanny state business.
And there you go.
And
well, as you asked, though, with so much sugar, is it cereal or candy?
Ah, yes. And again, a really interesting thing. So it wasn't until the 80s, 90s, actually, really, that we knew how much sugar was in our cereal and other products. Companies didn't have to disclose that. But some very inquisitive, actually a dentist out of a veterans hospital in Texas decided to find out for himself. He grabbed a whole bunch of cereals off the shelf of supermarkets there, tested them, and found sugar in levels as high as 70% undisclosed. And officials in Washington who were concerned with that began writing op-eds saying, hey, is this sugar or is this candy? And their opinion, of course, was it was candy.
And as you point out, sugar's in everything, including spaghetti sauce.
Totally amazing to me. And again, food scientists really pointed this out to me, which is that their concern about sugar is both kind of the levels of sugar in things like desserts and what have you, but it's more about the spread of sugar through the grocery store.
Let's talk about fat. Chocolate bars, of course, have sugar and fat. What do those ingredients do to eating habits, the combination?
Well, when you combine fat and sugar, something really, really interesting happens. And I should just start with fat briefly. Fat, unlike sugar, doesn't really have much of a bliss point. If there is one, it's up in heavy creams someplace. It also has twice the calories as sugar, so nutritionists are very wary about it. But when fat is in solid form, which is typically saturated fat, which is the fat that's linked to heart disease, your brain is less apt to detect it as fat as fat at all. And when you add a smidgen even of sugar to fat, the brain is even less apt to recognize that you're eating fat. And so you can just keep on eating and it won't send signals back to you, hey, you're getting enough of this, Michael, slow down.
Which brings us to the discussion of fat and cheese and milk fat skimmed from milk. What happened to the milk fat skimmed from milk?
1960s, North Americans stopped drinking as much whole milk because they were trying to limit their intake of saturated fat and calories, and not drinking a whole glass of milk was one easy way to do it. That created a problem for the dairy industry. They were left with a whole bunch of whole milk and milk fat that they extracted from whole milk to make the skim milk that people wanted to eat. They turned that milk fat and whole milk into butter, ice cream, and cheese, increasingly cheese. And they made so much cheese that the federal government, Washington, had to step in and start buying all this surplus cheese. It was stored, believe it or not, in caverns in Missouri until the number hit something like $4 billion of stored cheese that was going moldy. None other than Ronald Reagan came into office with his budget-cutting ways, and his Secretary of Agriculture said, this is totally dumb. We're going to stop buying this cheese going moldy thing. But they didn't want to abandon the dairy industry, so they created a marketing program that basically shifted the responsibility onto the consumers. They began raising taxes on the dairy industry, tens of millions of dollars every year, to encourage us to eat more cheese. And not just cheese as a delicacy you would have before a meal, as an hors d'oeuvre, but cheese as an additive to food. So you go to the dairy aisle these days, and it's bulging with bags of cheese that's, not in block or slice form anymore. It's shredded and cubed and diced and tubbed to encourage you to use cheese in cooking at home.
And it's also in lots of other foods, right?
And it's
in everything.
Lots of other foods around the grocery store. Frozen pizzas started getting stuffed with 1-2 cheeses in the crust, as well as piled on top.
So are you saying that our culinary tastes, like starting in the 60s, that we actually were sort of, without knowing it, they were sort of like pushing cheese as an ingredient onto us